The Galactic Empire stretched across 17,000 star systems, a vast tapestry of bureaucracy that had maintained peace for 3 millennia through the simple expedient of administrative tedium. Forms were filed in triplicate, disputes were resolved through subcommittees, and minor infractions were processed through departments so labyrinthine that most species simply gave up before reaching a resolution. It was a peace born not of wisdom, but of exhaustion, the kind that settles over a galaxy when even war becomes too much paperwork. In the Empire's grand hierarchy, species were cataloged with the same dispassionate efficiency used for stellar cartography. The Zephyrians controlled banking, the crystalline hegemony managed mining operations, and the aquatic federations oversaw water rights. Humans, when they were remembered at all, occupied a small footnote in the Imperial Species Registry. Asterisk Homo sapiens, classification, minor primate derivative. Threat level, negligible. Administrative priority, low, asterisk. Emperor Blaiadus the 43rd, who had earned the unofficial title, the Magnificently Stupid, through a series of spectacularly ill-conceived initiatives, ruled from the crystal spires of Galactic Central. His latest obsession was the Imperial Zoo, a sprawling complex designed to showcase the Empire's diversity to visiting dignitaries. The zoo was his pride, featuring specimens from across the known galaxy. Everything from the singing crystals of Melodia Prime to the fire-breathing serpents of Pyroxia. The collection lacks a certain primitive charm, Blaiadus mused during his weekly tour of the facility. His advisors, a collection of species who had mastered the art of agreeing with their emperor while secretly planning their own agendas, nodded sagely. "What did you have in mind, Your Magnificence?" asked Counselor Vex, a tall, pale being whose species had evolved beyond the need for facial expressions. "Humans," Blaiadus declared with the confidence of someone who had never been meaningfully challenged. "Specifically, they're young. I'm told human offspring are particularly engaging. Their emotional responses should provide excellent entertainment value." The bureaucratic machinery of the Empire ground into motion with its characteristic efficiency. Forms were processed, permits were stamped, and within 72 hours, an Imperial collection vessel was en route to the human colony of New Brooklyn in the Outer Rim territories. New Brooklyn was typical of human settlements, a collection of domed cities connected by transport tubes, surrounded by agricultural pods that turned the harsh alien soil into something resembling the earth their ancestors had left behind. The colonists had been there for 60 years, raising their children, building their lives, and paying their imperial taxes with the resignation of people who understood that citizenship in the Empire meant keeping your head down and your paperwork current. The Imperial collection vessel descended through New Brooklyn's atmosphere with the silent menace of a storm cloud. Captain Zorth, a professional who took pride in the clinical precision of his work, supervised the operation personally. 53 children between the ages of 5 and 12 were selected according to careful criteria, a representative sample of human development, gathered with the sort of methodical care usually reserved for botanical specimens. The children were sedated before they could comprehend what was happening. Their parents, caught in the paralysis fields that the collection team deployed with practiced efficiency, could only watch in horror as their sons and daughters were loaded into containment pods and transported to the waiting ship. Specimen collection complete, Captain Zorth reported to Imperial Command. No significant resistance encountered. Local population appears to be processing the event through primitive grief rituals. No political complications anticipated. The Empire waited for humanity's response with the disinterested patience of an institution that had weathered 3,000 years of minor complaints and diplomatic protests. They expected angry transmissions, perhaps a few strongly worded petitions, possibly even a request for audience with a mid-level administrator. What they received instead was silence. This silence, profound and absolute, was interpreted by Imperial analysts as submission. Clearly, their primitive social structures lacked the sophistication for meaningful political response, noted one intelligence report. The loss of offspring appears to be accepted as a natural hazard of existence under Imperial rule. What the Empire failed to understand was that humanity's silence was not submission. It was the quiet that comes before the storm, the held breath before the scream, the moment of perfect stillness that precedes absolutely devastating action. On the human world of Terra Nova, the Colonial Defense Council convened in emergency session. The chamber, carved from living rock deep beneath the planet's surface, had been designed for exactly this sort of crisis. Representatives from all 300 human worlds appeared via quantum entanglement communicators, their faces grim with an emotion that transcended mere anger. 53 children, announced Council President Sarah Chun, her voice steady despite the fury burning in her eyes. Taken from their homes, taken from their families, placed in an alien zoo for the amusement of creatures who see us as nothing more than specimens. The chamber erupted in voices, demands for immediate action, calls for measured response, strategic discussions about diplomatic channels. Through it all, one figure remained silent. Captain Brick Morrison sat at the far end of the council table, his weathered hands folded, his gray eyes fixed on something only he could see. Morrison had served in the Colonial Defense Forces for 37 years, rising through the ranks not through political maneuvering, but through the simple expedient of being right when it mattered most. He had fought pirates in the asteroid belt, negotiated ceasefires with hostile alien species, and personally led the evacuation of the Kepler colony when their sun went unstable. He was a soldier's soldier, respected by his peers and trusted by the civilians he had sworn to protect. Captain Morrison, President Chun said, the chamber falling silent at the mention of his name. The council would like to hear your thoughts on our response options. Morrison stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 decades of command decisions and the accumulated wisdom of a man who had seen both the best and worst of what humanity could accomplish. Madam President, honored representatives, he began, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. For 300 years, we have been citizens of this empire. We have paid our taxes, followed their laws, and accepted their casual dismissal of our species as the price of peace. We have built our colonies, raised our children, and minded our own business while they ignored us or treated us as curiosities. He paused, and something in his expression shifted, a hardening that spoke of decisions made and lines crossed. But they have taken our children. Our children, representatives. Not our resources, not our territory, not our pride. Our children. And that changes everything. The chamber was utterly still. The empire has ruled through administrative convenience and bureaucratic inertia for 3,000 years. Morrison continued. They maintain peace because no one has given them a reason to fight. They assume compliance because no one has shown them the cost of overreach. They see us as primitive because we have allowed them to see only what we chose to show them. President Chun leaned forward. What are you suggesting, Captain? Morrison's smile was sharp as a blade. I'm suggesting, Madam President, that the Empire is about to discover why humanity has been so very, very quiet for so very, very long. Over the next 18 hours, the true scope of humanity's hidden capabilities began to emerge. The Colonial Defense Forces, which Imperial intelligence had estimated at perhaps 50,000 personnel across all human worlds, revealed themselves to be a sophisticated military organization numbering in the millions. The primitive human settlements that dotted the outer rim were revealed to be heavily fortified positions, their defensive capabilities hidden behind facades of agricultural domes and mining operations. Most shocking of all was the fleet. While the Empire had cataloged perhaps 200 human vessels, mostly merchant ships and small patrol craft, the reality was closer to 15,000 combat-ready warships, their advanced stealth systems having kept them invisible to Imperial sensors for decades. How long have you been preparing for this? President Chun asked during a private briefing with Morrison, who had been unanimously appointed Supreme Military Commander by emergency vote. Since the day we joined the Empire, Morrison replied simply. We learned very early that the price of peace was the appearance of weakness. So we appeared weak. We paid our taxes, filed our reports, and built our defenses where they couldn't see them. We hoped we would never need them. And now, Morrison's expression was granted. Now, they have our children, Madam President, and they're going to give them back. The ultimatum was delivered to Emperor Blaiadus exactly 24 hours after the emergency session concluded. It was brief, precise, and utterly uncompromising. T.O. His Imperial Magnificence, Emperor Blaiadus the 43rd. From the Unified Human Colonial Defense Council. Immediate return of abducted human children *. Your Imperial forces have unlawfully abducted 53 human children from the colony of New Brooklyn. These children are to be returned to their families, unharmed and unaltered, within 24 standard hours of receipt of this communication *. Additionally, the Empire will provide 1. Formal apology from the Emperor himself. 2. Reparations to the affected families in the amount of 10 million Imperial credits per child. 3. Immediate revision of Imperial policy regarding human colonies. 4. Guarantee that no further collection activities will be undertaken against human populations. Failure to comply with these demands within the specified time frame will result in immediate military action by the Unified Human Colonial Defense Forces. We await your response. Captain Brick Morrison, Supreme Military Commander, Unified Human Colonial Defense Council. Emperor Blaiadus read the ultimatum 3 times. His advisors clustered around him in the Imperial throne room. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hum of the palace's atmospheric recyclers. This is a joke, the Emperor finally announced. Some sort of primitive posturing. Humans don't have a military. They barely have a government. Counselor Vex cleared his throat nervously. Your Magnificence, our intelligence services are reporting some unusual activity in human space. Ships appearing on sensors that weren't there before. Communications traffic that suggests a level of organization we hadn't previously. Nonsense, Blaiadus interrupted. File the communication in the diplomatic protests folder and increase security around the zoo. I want those specimens protected. As the Emperor's words echoed through the vast throne room, thousands of light years away, Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of the UHS Retribution, flagship of the Human Colonial Defense Fleet. Around him, the quiet efficiency of a military force that had trained for this moment for 3 centuries was evident in every movement, every order, every precisely calculated decision. All ships report ready, sir, announced Commander Torres, Morrison's chief of staff. Morrison nodded, his eyes fixed on the tactical display showing the positions of Imperial forces throughout the galaxy. They had 24 hours to respond. He hoped, for everyone's sake, that they would be reasonable. But, deep in his heart, Captain Morrison knew that some lessons could only be taught through overwhelming force, and that humanity was about to give the Galactic Empire the most expensive education in its 3,000-year history. Emperor Blaiadus was reviewing the morning's zoo attendance figures when the first reports began filtering in. Commander Thex burst into the Imperial throne room without ceremony, his scaled features displaying the kind of panic that 3 millennia of bureaucratic peace had nearly bred out of the Imperial military. Your Magnificence, Thex gasped, his breathing apparatus working overtime. We're under attack. Attack. Blaiadus set down his attendance charts with a mild irritation of someone whose morning routine had been disrupted. Who would dare attack the Empire? The Zephyrians are still paying off their trade dispute fines. The crystalline hegemony can barely manage their own internal politics and the aquatic federations. It's the humans, Your Magnificence. The throne room fell silent. Even the atmospheric recyclers seemed to pause. The humans? Blaiadus laughed, a sound like broken glass in a ceramic bowl. The primitive primates from the Outer Rim? Commander, perhaps you need to. His words were cut off as every display screen in the throne room activated simultaneously, showing the same image. Captain Morrison standing on the bridge of a warship that looked like nothing in the Imperial database. Behind him, dozens of similar vessels hung in space like predators made of metal and light. Emperor Blaiadus, Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly through the palace's communication system. "This is Captain Morrison of the Unified Human Colonial Defense Forces. 24 hours ago, we made certain demands regarding the return of our children. You have chosen not to respond." The Emperor stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for water. "As of this moment," Morrison continued, "we are implementing economic sanctions against the Galactic Empire. All human-operated facilities throughout Imperial space have been shut down. All human-manufactured goods have been removed from Imperial markets. All human technical personnel have been withdrawn from Imperial infrastructure projects. Across the galaxy, the immediate effects were catastrophic. On Rigel Prime, the atmosphere processors that maintain breathable air in the underground cities went offline when their human maintenance crews simply disappeared. The Empire's largest agricultural world, Ceres Major, ground to a halt as the human-designed irrigation systems stopped functioning without their operators. Banking systems throughout the inner worlds crashed as human-programmed financial algorithms shut themselves down in perfect synchronization. Furthermore, Morrison's voice continued, "We have begun selective disabling of Imperial military assets. We are targeting only unmanned installations and empty vessels. No Imperial personnel have been harmed, and none will be harmed unless you force our hand." As if to demonstrate his point, the tactical displays throughout the Imperial military command centers began showing the systematic destruction of unmanned satellite networks, automated defense platforms, and empty supply depots. Each strike was precise, surgical, and utterly unstoppable. Imperial forces attempting to intercept the human ships found themselves facing technology that was centuries ahead of anything in their arsenal. On the bridge of the Retribution, Morrison watched the tactical displays with the calm attention of a chess master executing a strategy he had planned for decades. The human fleet had divided into 17 task forces, each one targeting a different sector of Imperial space. They moved with perfect coordination, their stealth systems rendering them invisible until the moment they struck, their weapons systems demonstrating a precision that bordered on the supernatural. "Sir," Commander Torres reported, "we're receiving surrender requests from Imperial forces in the Vega sector. They're requesting instructions on how to avoid being targeted. Tell them to stand down and maintain position," Morrison replied. "No one gets hurt unless they force the issue. This is a rescue operation, not a war of conquest." The human ships were beautiful in their lethality, sleek forms that incorporated technologies the Empire had never dreamed of. Quantum drives that allowed instantaneous travel across galactic distances. Energy shields that could absorb and redirect Imperial weapons fire. Most impressive of all were the targeting systems that could disable specific components of enemy vessels without harming the crew inside. Within 6 hours of the operation's beginning, the Galactic Empire's military was effectively paralyzed. Not destroyed, disabled. Every major Imperial facility had been rendered inoperative, every fleet had been forced to stand down, and every communication network had been compromised. Yet Imperial casualty reports showed 0 deaths and fewer than 50 injuries, most of those from personnel who had panicked and hurt themselves while abandoning their posts. It was the most devastating military defeat in galactic history, accomplished with less loss of life than a typical traffic accident on Galactic Central. Emperor Blaiadus sat in his throne, staring at reports that made no sense. How could a species of primitive primates have built a military force that could cripple the Empire in less than a day? How could creatures he had dismissed as barely sentient have outthought, outmaneuvered, and outfought the combined forces of 17,000 star systems? "Your Magnificence," Counselor Vex said quietly, "perhaps we should consider responding to their demands." "Respond to their demands?" Blaiadus's voice cracked with indignation. "I am the Emperor of the Galactic Empire. I do not negotiate with specimens." As if summoned by his words, the throne room's main view screen activated. Captain Morrison appeared, but this time he was not on his ship's bridge. He was standing in what appeared to be a corridor, and behind him, Blaiadus could see Imperial guards lying unconscious on the floor. "Your Magnificence," Morrison said politely. "I'm currently aboard your palace station. I thought it might be more convenient to discuss this matter in person." The throne room doors opened, and Morrison walked in flanked by two human soldiers whose armor incorporated technology that made them look more like walking force fields than men. They moved with the fluid precision of people who had trained for this exact scenario 1,000 times. Blaiadus tried to stand, found his legs wouldn't support him, and remained seated on his throne. Up close, Morrison looked even more dangerous. Not because he was physically imposing, but because he radiated the kind of controlled competence that could reshape galaxies. "You have our children," Morrison said without preamble. "We want them back." This is impossible," Blaiadus stammered. "Humans are primitives. You don't have the technology for interstellar warfare. You don't have the organization for." "We've been part of your empire for 300 years," Morrison interrupted. "We've been watching you, learning from you, preparing for the day when your bureaucratic indifference would cross a line we couldn't ignore." He stepped closer to the throne, and Blaiadus could see something in the human's eyes that made him suddenly understand why predators existed in every ecosystem. "You want to know how we did it? How we built a military force that could defeat your empire in 6 hours. It's simple, Your Magnificence. We didn't build it to defeat your empire. We built it to protect our children. And you took our children." Morrison's voice never rose above conversational level, but somehow it filled the vast throne room with the weight of absolute certainty. Every parent in human space, every mother, every father, every guardian, spent the last 3 centuries preparing for the possibility that someone might threaten their children. We built our ships in the darkness between stars. We trained our soldiers in the empty spaces where your sensors couldn't find them. We developed weapons that could disable rather than destroy, because we knew that when the time came, we would need to be precise. He gestured toward the screens, showing the paralyzed Imperial fleet. "You see military defeat. We see a surgical operation to remove a threat to our young. You see impossible technology. We see 3 centuries of motivated parents working together to ensure their children's safety. You see the end of your empire's invincibility. We see what happens when you corner something that values its offspring more than its own life." Blaiadus found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What do you want?" "I told you what we want 24 hours ago," Morrison replied. "Our children, returned safely, an apology, reparations, and a guarantee that this will never happen again. And if I refuse?" Morrison's smile was sharp as a blade and cold as space. "Your Magnificence, you are currently sitting in a throne room surrounded by the most advanced military force in galactic history. Your empire's fleet is disabled, your communication networks are compromised, and your orbital defense platforms are offline. Every human facility in Imperial space has been evacuated, every human citizen has been withdrawn to safety, and every piece of human-designed technology has stopped working." He leaned forward slightly. "You're not in a position to refuse anything, but I'll tell you what happens if you try. We will take our children by force. We will make sure every species in the galaxy knows that the great Galactic Empire was brought to its knees by the primitive primates it took for granted. And then we will withdraw from Imperial space entirely, taking with us every piece of technology, every innovation, and every service that human citizens have provided to your empire for 3 centuries. The Emperor stared at him, finally beginning to understand the scope of his miscalculation. "Or," Morrison continued, "you can do the right thing. Return our children. Apologize for taking them. Pay the reparations we've demanded. And learn to treat humanity with the respect due to a species that has clearly demonstrated its capability to defend itself." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Blaiadus began, then stopped. His shoulders sagged as the weight of absolute defeat settled on him. "I will comply with your demands. All of them. All of them." Morrison nodded. "Commander Torres, signal the fleet. Stand down to defensive posture. The Emperor has agreed to our terms." The reunion took place on New Brooklyn, in the same dome park where the children had been taken 6 days earlier. 53 small humans ran into the arms of parents who had spent nearly a week living in the special hell reserved for those whose children are in danger. The sight of families reunited, of tears of joy replacing tears of anguish, was worth every ship in the human fleet. Morrison stood apart from the celebration, watching as Emperor Blaiadus himself delivered a formal apology to each family, along with certified credit transfers that would ensure the children's education and security for the rest of their lives. The emperor's face showed the kind of humility that only comes from having one's worldview completely shattered and then carefully rebuilt. Captain Morrison, President Chun approached him as the ceremonies concluded. The council is already receiving communications from other species throughout the Empire. They want to know how we did it. They want to know if we'll teach them. They want to know if humanity is accepting new alliance partners. Morrison nodded, his eyes still fixed on the children playing in the park. Tell them we're not interested in conquering anyone or teaching anyone how to build weapons. But we are very interested in working with species that understand the value of protecting the innocent. And the Empire? The Empire will endure, Morrison said, probably better than it did before. Nothing teaches respect like a demonstration of overwhelming force used with restraint. They'll remember this lesson for a long time. He turned to face her, and President Chun was struck by how tired he looked, not physically, but emotionally. The weight of command, of making decisions that affected billions of lives, had aged him visibly in the past week. We've shown them what we can do when our children are threatened, he said quietly. Now we have to show them what we can do when our children are safe. That's the harder lesson, but it's the more important one. The Six-Day War, as historians would later call it, fundamentally altered the balance of power in the galaxy. The Galactic Empire, humbled but not destroyed, began the slow process of rebuilding its military doctrine around the knowledge that there were species within its borders capable of resistance. Other minor species, inspired by humanity's example, began asserting their own rights and demanding their own respect. But perhaps the most important change was in how the Empire viewed the protection of children. Within a year of the conflict's end, the abduction of any sentient species' offspring became not just illegal, but one of the highest crimes against imperial law, punishable by permanent exile from civilized space. Emperor Blaiadus, no longer the magnificently stupid, became known as the surprisingly wise for his role in implementing these reforms. He would later write in his memoirs that the most valuable lesson of his reign was learning to distinguish between weakness and patience, between primitiveness and restraint. And on 300 human worlds throughout the galaxy, parents tucked their children into bed each night with the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that their young were safe, their families were protected, and that anyone who threatened either would discover that humanity's greatest strength had never been its technology, or its ships, or its weapons. It had always been its love.